Our personality is basically who we are, regardless of our mood change or our emotions. Okay, so what are the things that make up our personality? And these are things that psychologists have asked for a long time. Okay, so, a lot of it has to do with nature and nurture. If you're a shy person right now, are you going to be shy later on? Or does it depend on a situation that you're in? If you're a shy person and you really need to ask that person out on a date or do a class presentation or whatever it is, do you actually step out of your box and become somebody else for that moment? Okay, or do we learn our personalities as we go? So this section looks at how we've looked at personality in the past and how we look at it now. And we're going to learn all about that in Unit 10, Personality. Here we go, right now. Let's start by defining personality. Personality is your characteristic way of the way you think and you feel and you act. When we look at it, we wonder about a personality being stable or whether it changes through our lifetime. Our first thing we're going to look at, though, is some historical perspectives. We'll look at Freud's psychoanalytic perspective. Okay, here are the outcomes for it, and I know you guys are somewhat familiar with Freud at this point, but we'll see what he says about personality development. So first of all, Freud believes that we have different parts of the mind. We have a conscious mind and a preconscious mind and an unconscious mind. Okay, so the conscious is what you're typically aware of right at this moment. The preconscious, it's there. You can, if you can really think about it, you can pull it back out, and then the unconscious is where it's totally gone. And he thinks a lot of our personality is developed through our unconscious. So when we, in therapy, or we try to figure out what's happening in someone's unconscious, Freud believed free association was the way to go, where you would sit and just talk about anything, no matter how vile, vulgar, or embarrassing it might be, and that would give us clues into what's going on into that person's unconsciousness. Psychoanalysis was based on that as far as the therapy goes, that if we can divulge what the person is bothering the person, then they can actually cure themselves. The problem is because it's unconscious that they can't deal with it because they don't know what they're dealing with. The cornerstone of Freud's theory is really based on repressed ideas. And repression is the idea that we hold back feelings. And in Freud's case, a lot of it was sexual and aggressive, that we would block those from our consciousness. When we talk about repressed memories back in the memory unit, we looked at those situations where something is so horrific that your mind does not allow you to think about it, so it blocks it back into the unconscious, so it represses it. It's like protects your brain from having to deal with that. His personality structure, he had three kind of structures: the id, ego, and superego. So the id is the pleasure principle. That's your basic desires, your instincts, your sexual drives, your aggressive drives. People that become compulsive gamblers or alcoholics or drug users are probably just totally working on their id, those desires. Okay, the ego is the reality principle that tries to satisfy your id in a certain way. And as you get a little bit older, 3 to 6 years old, you start to identify with a parent, and you start to develop these values and morals that you carry along, which become your superego. So now your ego's job is to actually deal with pleasing the id and the superego, not upsetting either one. Superego is kind of like the angel on your shoulder when you're trying to do something, and the id's like the devil on your shoulder, and the ego has to mediate between them. You can see in this classical diagram here that your ego, your executive mediator, is mostly in the conscious area. This is an iceberg, so 3/4 of it is below, and this is why it's used as a model, so this represents your conscious thought, the water level. Your superego is also conscious, but a lot of it lies unconsciously. Your preconscious is here, which includes your ego. However, the id works solely unconsciously and drives your behavior. So for that reason, Freud looked at certain aspects. We talked about him before. He was actually a medical doctor that looked at neurology, and he would treat mostly females, and they would come into his office and he would treat them, and sometimes he'd find out problems that really couldn't be explained through neuroscience, and So he came up with these theories about how these mental problems, problems of the mind, were developed because of their development going through their psychosexual stages. And you probably remember these from last year, or you've heard of them: the oral, the anal, the phallic, latency, and genital stage, which each come with them their own kind of issues. So the oral stage, basically what this is based on erogenous zones. So this is where sexual pleasure comes from at these different age groups. So when you're first born to 18 months, the pleasure centers around the mouth. Now Freud would make sense of this by saying this is the age where, you put something near a baby's mouth, it will suck on it, it will bite it, they chew, those kinds of things right up to the 18 months. So if there are issues and problems going through this stage, we may fixate at this stage. The anal stage focuses on bowel and bladder elimination, coping with demands for control. So if you are, potty trained before you are ready, you may become very have an anal retentive personality, where you will try to maintain order and cleanliness to an obsessive level. If you were potty trained too late, you might get into the anal retentive, or expulsive, where everything is kind of messy and left unorderly in your life. The phallic stage is where the pleasure zone is in the genitals, and this goes from 3 to 6 years old. These are where the weird feelings like the Oedipus complex and stuff, which we'll talk about in a moment, shows up. The latency stage is about 6 to puberty. Latency means there's no sexual feelings. It's dormant at that time. And then in the genital stage, it's the maturation of sexual interest, right? The libido, or the erogenous zone, is centered on the genitals at this point. So the Oedipus complex we're talking about if you remember, the phallic stage, age 3 to 6, is the idea that unconsciously a young boy of that age wants to kill their father and sleep with their mother. The name comes from a play where Oedipus Rex accidentally slept with his mother and killed his father. The electric complex is the girl's idea, which is the opposite, where the girls want to kill their mothers and sleep with their fathers. However, this will change over time and be met because we start to identify with the same-sex parent. Therefore, it's almost like we can't beat them, so we join them. We want to become more like them. And this is where our gender identity can be formed. The fixation, though, if we're fixated in any of Freud's stages, we may regress to that stage. So if we fixate at an early stage, say the oral stage, and we're older, we're fixated on it, so we still have that idea of oral gratification. So to explain people that smoke, put things in their mouth, those kinds of things. Same thing with the anal retentive, anal expulsive personalities that we talked about. You'd be fixated at the anal stage. So this was kind of his theory, how development happened and how he could help people because they were fixated at certain things. Your brain had to deal with the anxiety of these issues as you grow. And so our brain develops ways to allow us to be okay with it. Repression, we talked about, this is your brain blocking it out. Regression is going back to an earlier stage, so you might act like you're young. So this might be, an older person throwing a temper tantrum, like a 7-year-old might or a 5-year-old might. Reaction formation is taking that anxiety-ridden feeling and then turning it into its opposite. So you may feel like you're an angry, unlikable person, so you go out of your way to be happy and cheerful. Projection is taking your anxiety-ridden feelings and then putting them on somebody else. So you may feel like you're inadequate, but you might look at others and say they're inadequate to make yourself feel better. So your brain kind of helps you, or your thoughts will help you in that place. Rationalization, I think this is one we do commonly, and all of these are kind of there that we do. The rationalization is we do something and then we kind of make sense of it. We punch our friend in the face and then we rationalize by saying, you know what, he had it coming. I just did what everybody wanted to do, so I'm the good guy in this one. Displacement, we get angry. You have a bad day at school or at work and you come home and you start yelling at your mom or your loved ones, or you kick your dog or whatever you do, and we're displacing our anger and letting it out somewhere else. Sublimation is taking something that's probably socially not acceptable and then finding an outlet that is socially acceptable. Perhaps we're an aggressive person and we want to fight and run in and hurt people and knock them down, so we play football. So that would be an acceptable way to get out of that feeling that we have. And of course, denial. We will deny, that we have these issues. I deny I have a drinking problem or a drug problem along those ways. So the defense mechanisms are the way that you naturally and unconsciously will cope with these things. And I'm sure you recognize situations where you've gone to these defense mechanisms. So when we evaluate the psychoanalytic perspective, there definitely is a lot of evidence to suggest, we don't really believe, most contemporary psychologists definitely don't believe that we as children don't, that's where we are dead set in our personality, that we may change later on. There's definitely nothing to suggest that it has to do with early sexual ages in a different erogenous zone. And repression, the cornerstone of really Freud's ideas, because you can find repression really in all of the defense mechanisms. Repression, when we try to search for, we talked about this in the memory unit, we look for repressed memories, and we find people that should have repressed memories actually remember those incidents better than they should. So there's a strong body of evidence, and a lot of people believe that repression really doesn't exist. Sure, people forget, and we regain memories. And if you go look in a toy box of toys that you had when you were younger, when you were 5 years old, and look at those, and you'll see the flood of memories coming back. Those memories weren't repressed; they were just simply forgotten along the way. Yet they lead there. So there are challenges to repression. So the psychodynamic theories are basically what we've taken from the modern views of the unconscious. Freud was very influential in making us look at the unconscious, but which part of it's true, which part is not. We still believe unconscious drives the conscious, but we don't believe in a lot of the details of his theories. So when we look at our modern approach, it's a psychodynamic theory. Kind of began by neo-Freudians. Remember, the word neo means new, like a neonate in the development unit means a brand new born. There was Alfred Adler and Karen Horney and Carl Jung. Adler looked at the inferiority complex. If we were good as long as we felt useful and not lesser than other people. Karen Horney's was idea with a sense of helplessness. Both of them believed that our childhood was or a personality was developed in our childhood, but it wasn't necessarily sexual in nature. It was a sense of helplessness. For example, she came up with the idea of penis envy in girls. Now, Jung's is the collective unconsciousness theory, where he believed that all of our ancestors and stuff have carried on these genes or have passed on the ideas that of fears and all those kinds of things from the past. It's not just from our experiences. For example, everybody wants to have a hero to follow. Everybody, believes that, there's bad things that are the kind of the same. So these are archetypes, basically, that represent our thoughts. And today we believe this is probably true to a point. Through genetics, there's been these certain things passed on, especially when we talk about fears. Fears are the same all around the world, but we don't really believe it's been carried on from our ancestors as far as the collective unconsciousness go in the way that Jung did. Really is kind of carried on from your ancestors if through adaptation and survival of the fittest. Okay. So the unconscious process, how do we find out about it? How do we measure it? All those types of things. Basically what we use is a projective test. Now you think of projection from the defense mechanisms. It's putting on what you're thinking onto another person. So projective tests, we'll give them a test and they will project what their inner thoughts and inner feelings or unconscious is because it's unguarded at this time. The TAT or the thematic apperception test is a test where we'll give these people the test, it's a picture that's an ambiguous situation. We ask them to make a story up about it. So the way the story goes gives us clues into the unconsciousness. Is it a story about, violence or anger or sexual kind of ideas? And that gives us an idea what's going on in their unconscious. Now, the Rorschach ink blot test is something you're probably really familiar with. It's just ink blots, and then people give their perceptions of what they see in those ink blots, and then the psychoanalytic therapist will make a judgment about what's going on in that person's unconsciousness. These tests, although they are commonly used, they have improved a little bit in validity. The reliability of these tests is not very good, meaning different therapists will have different interpretations of what somebody says. Yet psychoanalysis is quite an effective therapy. And it's not quite what you see on TV, psychoanalytic therapy, but we'll talk more about that in our second last unit. So when we look at our modern unconscious, there are similar things that are going on in everybody's mind. One of the things is exemplified by the false consensus effect. The false consensus effect is the idea that everybody else feels and thinks like you do, which is erroneous. So if you're a happy-go-lucky person, you assume everybody else is happy-go-lucky when you're dealing with them. Or if you're kind of sad and moody, that you assume everybody else does. Or you like Jimmy Kimmel as opposed to all the other late-night TV shows, so you assume other people probably think that same way. A lot of our anxieties in our conscious mind, one of the theories we have is a terror management theory. These anxieties come up from, we know we're going to die one day. We know that we have a demise. And a lot of the things that we do as far as our personality goes is in protection to help us through that situation that we have there. Okay, so that is our first part of personality. And I'll see you guys in class. We'll be coming up with personality part 2 very shortly. All right, bye for now.